afternoon, everyone. If we could have your attention for just a few minutes and then we can resume eating, that'd be great. Good afternoon. I hope everyone found the morning sessions of the conference to be informative and constructive to your work. As was discussed in the morning videos and plenary session, housing is an essential component of strong communities, especially here in New Jersey. With housing as a critical base, New Jersey can continue to attract businesses and create jobs. This is why the conference is designed around economic development, offering sessions that address important issues such as equity programming, spurring community investment and job creation, public-private partnerships, and how repurposing existing structures can spur positive community and economic development activity. These key issues are what bring us here today, so we can have conversations about how we can best help our communities find innovative ways to thrive. Helping to lead this conversation is Tim Sullivan, CEO of the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. With the creative work NJEDA is doing to help drive real estate projects that advance the state's economic development objectives, Tim is a great person to introduce our keynote speaker for today. So without further ado, I turn the microphone over to Tim. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. First things first, let's congratulate the Commissioner on being the Commissioner. I have a little bit of business to do before I get into introducing our extraordinary keynote speaker. A couple things I want to do. Recognize some of our sponsors. If I don't recognize the sponsors, everyone's got to cough up $20 for lunch. So permit me to thank the sponsors. First up is Dimension Responsible Energy, who are our premier sponsor. They're a community solar developer that partners with affordable housing organizations to bring energy savings to low and moderate income households throughout New Jersey. Please thank them. Anyone here from Dimension want to stand up and take a bow? They're probably outside working, trying to sell some community solar development, so that's probably a good idea. I also want to thank our lunch sponsor, Nan McKay, for their sponsorship of this lunch, which is a great meal so far. Thank you. Not that wasn't serious, but on a more serious note, I'd be remiss standing here in Atlantic City at this conference in particular and not say a word about the late great Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver. This conference isn't the same without her. The work of supporting Atlantic City isn't the same without her. The state's not the same without her, but and I know that loss is carried so deeply by her DCA family, her HMFA family, her NJRA family, certainly those of us at the EDA who worked under the leadership of the great Lieutenant Governor. She is missed, and the work that she led so tirelessly here in Atlantic City and across the state carries on, and that's what this conference is about. We do that with her in our hearts, and we do that with a heavy heart but an optimistic outlook that the work that she led goes on. And there's probably no better person than the gentleman I'm about to introduce to talk about how some of that work can happen. We're at a conference of folks who care about housing and economic development, and so Don Peebles is someone who basically needs no introduction to that group. It's hard to think. Don is one of the most prolific and successful developers anywhere, any asset class, period. But it's hard to think of someone whose name is more associated with doing the right thing around development, and particularly focusing on what he calls affirmative development, and those principles of how to not just build buildings, but invest in opportunity, invest in people, invest in communities. He's a legend in this industry, and we're honored to have him here. I'll let him tell the story, but I think most of what you learned about how to do that came from Rutgers Newark. Is that as I understand it? I'll let him tell that story. But Don is the founder, chairman, and CEO of the Peebles Corporation. He runs a multi-billion-dollar portfolio, billion with a B, portfolio of real estate all throughout the country in virtually every asset class you can think of. There was an effort here to sell him on some real estate opportunities in New Jersey while we were having lunch, so hopefully we'll see him doing some more development here in New Jersey. He's also someone I know is someone that Governor Murphy and our entire team thinks of as one of the wise people in the world, not just around development broadly, but around equitable development, inclusive development. And I remember being on a conference call with you during the peak of the pandemic thinking, gosh, when we come out of this, we got to really take a run at equitable development in a bigger, deeper, stronger way. And the Murphy Oliver and now Murphy Way administration, I think, takes that to heart. And the work that Don has done around the country is a model for what we should be doing more of here in New Jersey, what we should be doing more of in our cities. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Don Peebles.
Well, good afternoon. Tim, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's good to be here in New Jersey. You know, as a real estate developer, it's not often that I hear kind remarks. Certainly not kind words of introduction and welcoming. And so, you know, in fact, I was surprised that as a developer, I was asked to come and speak to you. I mentioned this to a good friend of mine who happens to be one of our lawyers, and he said he was surprised too. He said that developers are more disliked than lawyers. So it reminds me of a story about a developer and a lawyer and a developer who dies, and I'll share it with you. So this developer dies, and he reports to the pearly gates, and he's greeted by St. Peter. St. Peter checks his dossier, and the developer's name is not on the list. So naturally, the developer goes and reports to the gates of hell. Satan welcomes him with open arms. But after about 3 months or so, the developer gets a little uncomfortable with his surroundings. So he starts making some improvements. First thing he does is install some air conditioning. Next thing is flushing toilets. And then some escalators. And so one day, Satan's kicked back by the fireside and the phone rings, and it's God. And God says, so how's it going down there in hell? Satan says, actually not too bad. Things are pretty good down here. We got air conditioning, we got flushing toilets, we got escalators. I mean, who knows what this developer is going to come up with next? God says, you got a developer down there? That's a mistake. Send him up here immediately. Satan says, no way. I like having a developer on staff. I'm keeping him. And God said, if you don't send him right up here immediately, I'm going to sue. And Satan starts laughing euphorically and says, oh yeah? Well, where are you going to get the lawyers? So developer and all, I'm happy to be here in New Jersey, and especially here in Atlantic City. I mean, I have a long history in New Jersey and spent considerable time here in the 1970s with visiting my aunt and uncle who lived not too far from here in East Brunswick, New Jersey. I also attended Rutgers University. And I attended them at a time when they were ranked #1 in basketball in the country. So it's been a while. And so I have a long history in New Jersey. And I can remember, for example, when Governor Brendan Burns signed the Casino Control Act into law in the summer of 1977. And I just completed my junior year in high school at U.S. Capitol Page High School in Washington, D.C., and I was visiting my aunt and uncle. And I was politically focused because I'd spent a couple years in high school working on Capitol Hill. And so I got into understanding casino gambling. And that time, by the way, only one place in the country had casino gambling, and that was Nevada. And so proponents of casino gambling in New Jersey argued that that gambling would revitalize Atlantic City and attract tourism to Atlantic City and Atlantic County, and it would provide funds to support programs for the elderly and disabled. And there was going to be economic opportunity for all, especially residents of Atlantic City and Atlantic County. The casinos were going to provide long-awaited economic inclusion for Atlantic City's black residents and its black businesses. And so as an ambitious 17-year-old, I was excited by the promise of opportunity as I was personally aware of the major obstacles black Americans confronted in this country. However, things in the 1970s were rapidly changing, and Atlantic City was going to be leading the way of a growing nationwide effort of economic inclusion. And I saw firsthand the devastation resulting from economic discrimination. I was personally affected by it because I watched my mother. And so my mother, give you a little bit of history, my history, and give you a little history about my mother. My mother married my father at 16 years old. She gave birth to me at 19. So my parents divorced when I was 5 years old, and my mother became the sole breadwinner in our household at 24 years old. In 1968, in search of a better life, my mother moved us from Washington, D.C. to Detroit, Michigan, where her sister and her brother-in-law were living because my uncle was doing his internship and residency in medicine in Detroit. So she secured her real estate sales license, and a few years later started her own real estate brokerage company. For several years, things were very good, and then the recession hit in the summer of 1973, and we moved back to Washington, D.C. But before moving back, my mother had applied for a position as sales director of a new development in southwest Washington, D.C. called Town Center. And back then, there was no internet, of course, no video conferencing, no Zoom, so she simply mailed her resume along with an introductory letter. She got a phone interview, and they hired her. So, excited to return to our hometown, we moved back to Washington, D.C. And so my mother reported to work the first day, and at the end of the day, the head of the company that was developing that project brought her into his office, and he fired her. He said that the sales team was not ready to be led by a black woman, and that he did not think that the buyers that they were trying to attract would be receptive to buying their homes from a black woman. So my mother had to support us, so she got a temporary job as a secretary, and so she went to different companies as a temp while she tried to figure it out. And so one of those jobs happened to be at Fannie Mae. And so she moved around to a couple of the different executives, and she met a former congressman named Joe Holt. And he now was working in a senior position at Fannie Mae. And he was working long hours and so forth, so he got to know my mother a little bit. And he was astonished that she was working as a secretary with all of her experience. And so he then had her promoted to a mortgage analyst and then a mid-level executive at Fannie Mae. And so she went on and held that position while I went through high school. And then once I graduated, she went back into starting her own real estate appraisal and consulting business. And while she was able to start a new business and build it, she was never the same. She had, her dreams were shattered, her ambitions were shattered. It was a difficult time for us. And so that experience shaped me and shaped me as a person. And it also shaped me in terms of what I wanted to do with my life. So I dreamed of owning a development business one day and owning a company where everyone could work, prosper, and have great opportunity and go as far as their hard work and their knowledge would take them. So for the past 40 years, my company, the Peebles Corporation, has been an environment of economic opportunity for everybody. And with this strong sense of purpose, after my freshman year at Rutgers, I left and went back home to Washington, D.C., and got a job as a sales agent. And that was 1979. And by the way, interest rates were 20%. So imagine, we just left an environment where interest rates were 2.5%, and we're very worried that they're now 6.5%. But that was at 20%, so I could sell but no one could qualify for a mortgage. So I was struggling to earn a living. So I took some appraisal classes, and I started working for my mother as an appraiser. And then I worked for another firm that was more focused on commercial appraising. And then I started my own firm in 1983. So at 23, I decided I would go out on my own, start my company, and get on with the dream I had to, build a business. And so we started an appraisal business and ended up having HUD, Veterans Administration, and other banks as our customers, and grew that business and ended up having contracts to review HUD underwriters and HUD appraisers as well. And then in 1986, by happenstance, one of the subtenants in my office space came to me, and he said, I've got a property that you should buy. And I had an interest in getting into development. And this property was in southeast Washington, D.C., in an area called Anacostia, one of the most economically neglected communities in Washington, D.C., a predominant African-American community, though. And so I said, well, why would I want to build here? I want to build a project in downtown D.C. And he showed me a letter. And he showed me a letter that was on the letterhead of the mayor of the District of Columbia. Now, at that time, I had been chairman of the Property Tax Appeal Board in Washington, D.C., and was appointed by that very mayor to chair that position. And so this letter was a commitment to pre-lease office space in a proposed building on this site that this broker was going to sell to me. And I said, well, but it was addressed to another developer, a larger developer in Washington, D.C. I said, well, why are you showing it to me? He said, well, my client wants $900,000, and this developer only wants to pay $750,000. I said, okay, well, I figured if the mayor were going to lease from this guy, he'd lease from me. And so I went and assembled some investors, and we put the property into contract, and then approached the city to do a deal. And the city was going to lease from the other developer at $22.50 a foot, and we offered $18.75 a foot. And I'll never forget when my investors, we were arguing over how to price the lease. And they said, this is a minority deal. It's supposed to cost more money. We should charge them $25. I said, well, you don't really understand how this really works. It's a double standard. So we're not going to be successful for me just going in there and matching. We're going to have to be better. And ultimately, that saved the day, because right before the lease was signed, the losing developer leaked the story to the Washington Post. And the Washington Post did a front page story on my little building in Anacostia. And the saving grace was that we kept arguing and it kept hammering in the point that we were less money than the other developer. And so ultimately, we got our building built, and I learned an important lesson, and it validated some other things. So when we got our lease done, what I realized is, one, there wasn't going to be a fan club for me, that the Washington Post and the media were not going to be my ally. They were going to be my obstacle. But I would have to navigate and understand how to work within that structure, and that we would have to be better each time out of the gate. And so that formed the structure of how we had to do business, but also I felt that I was working for a higher purpose. And a higher purpose of knocking down a barrier, because up until that point, there hadn't been a single major commercial office building in Washington, D.C. developed and owned by a black person. And so one, I would not, which is an absurd statistic, but somebody had to knock that barrier down, and I felt that I was given a great opportunity to do that. And so we built that building. It's about $10 million, and delivered it early, under budget, and that was 30 some odd years ago. My son just finished renovating the building about a year or so ago, and the city released it for another 16 years. And that building kickstarted economic revitalization of Anacostia that today has billions of dollars of investment, including the headquarters for the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Community Development. So many other things have taken place, and economic activity and economic development has been stimulated over there. Gerard, who runs our affordable housing business, he and Donahue finished a project over in that area that was another affordable housing development. And so from that little building and that one opportunity, we went on to develop and acquire over $2 billion of commercial real estate in Washington, D.C. And then from there, we have grown to where we are today, which is a pipeline of about $10 billion in business. And we strive to knock down barriers and help open the doors of opportunity to women and people of color. And I call this approach affirmative development. And my wife is a person who trademarked that phrase because it describes exactly how we do business. We take affirmative, aggressive steps to include women and people of color in all aspects of our business. And a big part of the purpose of why I continue to engage in this business is to help create more women and black developers. Now, that hasn't been easy because the real estate business, like every other business, to be successful, there are three key ingredients: talent, opportunity, and capital. So the major attraction to the real estate industry is low barriers to entry. I mean, that's probably why I'm pretty good at it, right? Because no educational barriers, you can be entrepreneurial and be creative. You can start off small and you can keep scaling up, and then there's no limit to how far you can go. And also, you get the benefit of leverage. Unlike most businesses, to build, say, to own or acquire a $500 million business, you have to have some money. Well, in the development business, it would not be unusual for a developer to build a $500 million building and have $10 million of equity in that project, and then pay themselves $18 million in development fees. So on a net basis, they pocket $8 million and get to build a $500 million project, and then if it all works out, then they get a big promote, which is a profits interest in the project, and they do very well. And if it doesn't work out, then the investors and their lenders lose money. So in essence, developers rarely have a lot of capital in the deal, but they have access to capital. And that's where we have a tale of two communities, two experiences. Black Americans and women are solid and strong on talent, but continue to be denied fair and equal access to both opportunity and capital. So let's look at Atlantic City. Atlantic City is 33% African American. Since 1977, the city when the city secured gaming rights, there has not been one casino owned by an African American or woman. Not one. And by the way, a majority of the customer base fits those two demographics. So as recently, though, as in September of 2020, for the peak of inclusion, the peak of economic inclusion here is in 2020, 4 of Atlantic City's 9 casinos were managed by women. The Tropicana, the Ocean Casino Resort, Bally's, and Borgata, which is run by a black woman. But still, not one is owned by a woman or a person of color. And why is that? It's simple. It's access to capital. So real estate is a capital-intensive business, and larger developers, as I just gave you an example, rely on banks to provide them loans and private equity to provide them the equity capital to fund their projects. So here's a statistic for you. there's $82 trillion currently invested in venture capital and private equity here in this country. $82 trillion. Now, when we were trying to save the country from COVID, the argument was whether to spend $3 or $4 trillion. So $82 trillion. Now, out of that $82 trillion, less than 2% is invested in firms founded, run, or owned by women and people of color combined. Think about what I just told you, that more than half the population demographics gets less than 2% of access to capital. Now, companies led by black women receive less than 0.3%. So these are statistics in good times. Let's take a look at what's been happening recently. Venture capital funding dropped by 36% as inflation and interest rates surged. Financing for black businesses saw a steeper drop of 45%. Access comes primarily from banks and private equity. Black American and women entrepreneurs also confront incredible disparities in lending practices. These practices have created and perpetuated extreme wealth disparities in America. And the sad irony is that the largest investor group in private equity are public employee pension systems. Whose money is that? Public employee pension systems like states like New York, California, Texas, Florida, New Jersey. A large percentage and a majority of the employees whose money is placed in these public pension systems are women and people of color. So women cannot get fair access to their own money. People of color cannot get fair access to their own money. And in fact, their own money is being used to expand the wealth and income disparities I just outlined. So while New Jersey is diverse, 16% African American, for example, less than 10% of the businesses in New Jersey are black. Look at the $90 billion pension system here. And as you heard earlier, it did not have an asset manager of color until 2022. And that's after the conference call that was referred to in my kind introduction, where when Governor Murphy was on, and we talked about this, and then he took action, and now the state has a emerging and diverse asset manager program. Because Governor Murphy understood that to have real economic inclusion, we must expand the number of diverse businesses and entrepreneurs, because then it's diverse businesses and entrepreneurs who will invest in other diverse businesses and entrepreneurs and create economic opportunity so that we can get to this place in America where we all have the same chance, where we all have the same opportunity. And Governor Murphy understood that the state must lead the way to provide access to capital. He knew that the fuel which propels business is capital. So he took decisive action after so many of his progressive predecessors didn't. He has taken the first step in what will be a much longer journey, and a lot more needs to be done. Most major pension systems have emerging or diverse asset manager programs and have had it a long time ago. Even the state of Texas has an emerging managers program, in fact, one of the most aggressive in the United States. These programs have been in place for 2 decades. Take a look at California, which has been the leader in economic inclusion. So for over 30 years, the California Public Employee Pension System has been implementing emerging manager programs and hiring diverse investment managers. So New Jersey's emerging manager platform was just implemented last year. So I ask, what took so long? I mean, why did it take 30 years for New Jersey to follow? I believe it's because pension fund investments and economic inclusion have not been the salacious news and stories, and the media has ignored this injustice, and thus the public is unaware of these extreme economic exclusions. Over time, this type of meaningful initiative will change things, though. But change is long overdue, as the impact on our society is devastating. So the wealth disparity in New Jersey is shocking. I'm not sure many of you all know what it is. Let me tell you what it is. The average median net worth for a New Jersey white household is $352,000, the highest in America. But for New Jersey's black families, it's just $6,100. That disparity is 58 to 1. So a white household has 58 more money, 58 times more net worth than a black household. And as bad as that sounds, you can take a look at Boston, where the median net worth of a white household is $250,000. And for a black household, it's $8. $8. So the disparity there is 31,500 to 1. So this disparity, though, is not unique to New England. It's a nationwide issue, and I believe it is a major contributor to the divisiveness we have in America today. Many of our fellow citizens believe that the American dream is not accessible to them, and they're right. These statistics prove it. Black households have $12 for every $100 of a white household. Capital is the essential building block of opportunity. So without it and without access to it, we will make no progress. Let's use an example of one of the companies that has been in the news for a while, WeWork. WeWork, and most of us know who it is, and most of us know what it is. It's simply shared office space. So over a 12-year period, WeWork raised $22 billion of institutional capital and are now finding themselves on the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, it's astonishing how a concept of shared offices that's been around for decades could raise tens of billions of dollars using an archaic idea. In fact, in the 1980s, when I first started my development business, our offices in Washington, D.C. were in shared offices. It's unfathomable to me that 40 years later, somebody could raise $22 billion around that strategy. Now think about that, though, in contrast, many female and minority startups with far better ideas, far more original ideas, cannot raise $100,000, much less $22 billion. The allocation of capital is not representative of our country's demographics and has got to change. Black Americans comprise 14.2% of the United States population, but black businesses comprise only 2.2% of the nation's 5.7 million employer businesses. That's just 15% of our actual population demographics. In 2020, black business owners employed more than 1.3 million people and created nearly 50,000 new jobs, adding an additional $1.7 billion in aggregate payroll to the U.S. economy. If black businesses continue to grow at its current rate of 4.72%, it will take 256 years to reach parity with the share for black people in America. It would take 256 years. So what that says is that we are not moving fast enough, and that these obstacles have got to be knocked down, and we've got to put our foot on the accelerator and move forward. We have to take bold, affirmative, aggressive steps to change this. If we were going to try to change this in 15 years, we'd have to see a 74% growth rate in black-owned businesses. To do it in 25 years, we'd have to see a 45% annual growth rate. And to do it in 50 years, it would take a 22% growth rate. So we have a lot of work to do and very little time to do it, because providing more black business owners equitable access to capital and resources and opportunities is good for America. It would unlock $1.5 trillion in annual gross domestic product. The state of New Jersey should and can set an example by making the state the most pro-business environment for women and people of color. When we look going north to the mecca of capitalism, New York City, we can look at what we see there. With a population of 20 million, New York State is 18% black, 20% Hispanic, and 55% female. There are significant discrepancies on who has access to capital. If New York City, though, is known for anything, it's known for its dramatic skyline. It is a land of skyscrapers, and yet not one skyscraper in the city has ever been built by an African-American developer or a woman developer. I'm on a personal quest to change that. I like philosophy, and there's a phrase that Robert Kennedy used to use, and he would say, some people see things as they are, and they ask, why? I dream of things that never were, and I ask, why not? And so my company and I have proposed to build in New York City the fourth tallest building in the world and the tallest building in the United States. It would rise 1,600 feet tall, and we have named it Affirmation Tower. And we named it Affirmation Tower because it will affirm America's promise to us all, that everyone has an opportunity. This building will be designed by women and people of color, 80% African American owned. It will be constructed by the oldest and largest black construction company in the country, and it will be a mecca of economic inclusion, and it will house the Civil Rights Museum, which is long overdue. Because it is a building whose time has come, and it is a time where all of us need to stand up and say that we want our seat at the table, and we want an equitable piece of the pie. We can be excited and proud that our country has come a long way, but when it comes to civil rights, we've come a long way, but when it's come to economic inclusion, almost no progress has been made. And for example, home ownership of black Americans has remained unchanged since Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. 42% of black households owned their home in 1970. Today, it's 44%. Think about that. So the progress is not happening fast enough. So under President Obama, in 2004, it was 49% before he came in. During his term, it got up to 48. when he left office, it was 44%. And why is that? Income disparities are largely due to the numbers of what I told you, and those income disparities drive the ability to buy home ownership. And one thing also, and we talked about this over lunch, I mean, I'm a big proponent of affordable housing, but I'm a proponent of affordable housing ownership. We cannot continue to allow these politicians to try to make our community comfortable in poverty. And I keep telling people, this is not a black issue. This is not a woman issue. This is an American issue. I mean, our democracy is a capitalistic democracy. And the pillars of our democracy rest upon capitalism. If capitalism is inequitable and unfair, then our democracy will fail. It will change. It will not be the democracy that we all love and enjoy. Capitalism cannot endure inequity. And that is not just a political point, it's an economic reality. And until access to capital is fair, we are not protected, and our democracy is not protected. If we sit by and allow these inequities to continue, the foundation of the American ideals will continue to weaken. We all must be a part of transforming our society. When we are in positions of influence and authority, we need to work together and effectuate change. I will say that this, and I can say this, that far too often, when my people get into positions of power, they forget where they came from. When they make some money, they don't look back. And when they have a chance to change things, they are unwilling to put themselves into harm's way. So I could not, I grew up during the civil rights movement. I remember when Dr. King was assassinated. I remember when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. I saw the injustices my grandparents endured and my parents endured. And so I realized, and I knew back then, that they weren't fighting so that I could make a little bit of money and be comfortable. They were fighting to be about change. And so while they fought for the right for most of us to be able to come in here and sit down today and have lunch in this place, my job and all of our jobs is to fight this other frontier, and that's economic frontier. When Dr. King was killed, he was doing the Poor People's Campaign. It was about economic inclusion. And so my company is a tool of transformation. We have committed to over 35% of the $8 billion of development running through our pipeline right now to go to firms owned by African Americans and women. We have historically done over 25% of all of our business with minority firms. So I believe that we all as entrepreneurs and business people have a responsibility to promote economic inclusion in our nation. We also have the responsibility to speak about it, to educate, to challenge, even when it makes people uncomfortable, because we should all be uncomfortable with the current disparities. Everyone in this room should feel the same sense of obligation. Each of us must work in whatever capacity we are in to achieve equitable opportunities across the board for all of our fellow citizens. Edmund Burke once said, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph in the world is for good men to do nothing." I paraphrase that to say for good men and women to do nothing. So it's up to us. It's up to us to change this economic inequity. It's up to us to create an environment of opportunity for our own generation and for future generations. But no one's going to do it for us. We are the ones that have to do it. And I'll leave you with a quote, one of my favorite quotes from my friend and former President Barack Obama. He once said, "Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the change we seek." Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Shh. Now, before we run out to get our ice cream, because that's where we're going, if we could just be still for 1 second. Mr. Peebles is not going anywhere. If we could just be still for 1 second. He dropped some gems here today, and we want to say thank you. He gave us a charge here today, and we want to say, let's go. Let's get to work, and let's make a difference in the people's lives that we're charged and responsible for. Don Peebles, you are the man. Thank you so much. We're walking out of here a little straighter, a little taller, a little more confident, and we're going to make change based on what you said. And if things are the same next year, then we failed. And we didn't hear you, but you gave us our marching orders, good sir. And we thank you very much for your time here today. Now, go enjoy ice cream.